Every parent's worst nightmare is discovering that the person they trusted most with their child was the very one who betrayed that trust. For the families of Millbrook Creek, that nightmare became reality when 8-year-old Sarah McKinnon whispered her grandfather's terrible secret to Sheriff Clay Hartwell. Ezra McKinnon was the town's most respected man, a founding father who built half the businesses and earned the trust of every family in the valley. But when Clay found Sarah standing beside her grandfather's blood-stained bed, trembling as she spoke of things no child should ever know, everything changed. The sheriff faced an impossible choice: protect an innocent child or keep the peace in a town that would rather look away than face the ugly truth about their beloved patriarch, in a place where family honor meant everything and secrets stayed buried. Clay had to decide if he was brave enough to seek justice that would break everyone's heart. What happens when doing what's right means destroying everything you've sworn to protect? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Millbrook Creek's main street, illuminating the weathered wooden storefronts that had stood for nearly 3 decades. Sheriff Clay Hartwell walked his usual patrol route, his boots echoing against the boardwalk planks that Ezra McKinnon himself had helped lay when this town was nothing more than a trading post and a dream. Clay had been sheriff here for 20 years, watching Millbrook Creek grow from a collection of tents and temporary structures into a proper town with a church, a school, and families who'd put down real roots. At 52, he'd seen his share of trouble: cattle rustlers who thought they could take advantage of isolated ranches, gamblers who couldn't accept their losses gracefully, and the occasional land dispute that got heated enough to require intervention. But Millbrook Creek was the kind of place where most problems could be solved with a firm handshake and a man's word, where children played safely in the streets and neighbors looked out for one another. The town owed much of its stability to Ezra McKinnon, now 71 years old and still the most influential man in the valley. Ezra had arrived here in 1843 with nothing but a wagon, a strong back, and a vision for what this place could become. He'd built the first general store, helped organize the first church services, and when the railroad finally came through in 1851, he'd made sure it stopped right here in Millbrook Creek instead of passing them by for some other settlement. The cornerstone of St. Matthew's Church still bore Ezra's name, carved deep into the granite he'd hauled himself from the quarry, 15 miles north. Every Sunday, families gathered in that church to worship, and every Sunday, Ezra McKinnon sat in the front pew, his silver hair combed neat, his hands folded in prayer. Children knew him as the kindly grandfather who always carried peppermint sticks in his vest pocket and never forgot a birthday. Mothers trusted him to watch their little ones during church socials. Fathers respected his business sense and sought his counsel on everything from crop rotation to family matters. Clay's own wife, Martha, often said that Ezra McKinnon was the kind of man who made civilization possible on the frontier. He was proof that a person could build something lasting and good, that strength didn't always have to come from a gun or intimidation. In a land where might often made right, Ezra had shown that wisdom and generosity could be just as powerful. That's what made this Tuesday morning so difficult to comprehend. Clay had been finishing his breakfast when young Tommy Fletcher burst through the door of the sheriff's office, his face pale and his words tumbling over each other. Sarah McKinnon needed help, Tommy said, and she was asking for the sheriff specifically. Not her parents, not Dr. Morrison, not even Reverend Walsh. She wanted Sheriff Hartwell, and she wanted him now. Clay had known Sarah since she was born. She was Ezra's granddaughter through his son, Robert, a quiet man who ran the town's feed store with steady competence, but none of his father's natural leadership. Sarah's mother, Emily, had been one of Clay's students back when he'd briefly tried, teaching before taking up the badge. She was a gentle woman who'd married Robert more for his kindness than passion, and together They'd raised Sarah to be polite, well-mannered, and perhaps a bit too trusting for her own good. At 8 years old, Sarah McKinnon was the kind of child who curtsied when introduced to adults and always remembered to say please and thank you. She helped her mother with household chores without being asked, listened attentively during Sunday sermons, and treated her grandfather Ezra with the deep reverence that frontier children learn to show their elders. Clay had never known her to be anything but obedient and cheerful. That's why he'd been so concerned when Tommy Fletcher described the little girl he'd found that morning. According to Tommy, Sarah had been standing in her grandfather's bedroom, still in her nightgown at nearly 10 o'clock, staring at something on the bed with an expression Tommy had never seen on any child's face. When Tommy had called out to her, she'd turned to him with eyes that looked, in his words, like she'd seen something that weren't meant for children to see. Clay had followed Tommy McKinnon to the large house on Elm Street that Ezra had built for himself back in 1847. It was the finest home in Millbrook Creek, with real glass windows, painted shutters, and a wraparound porch that caught the evening breeze. The house where Ezra had raised his 3 children after his wife died, where he'd hosted countless church dinners and town meetings, where half the important decisions in Millbrook Creek's history had been made over coffee and handshakes in the front parlor. The front door had been standing open, which was unusual. Ezra was a careful man who believed in keeping his home secure, especially with all the valuable items he'd accumulated over the years. Clay had called out as he entered, but received no answer. The house felt strangely empty, though he could hear sounds coming from upstairs. He'd found Sarah in her grandfather's bedroom, just as Tommy had described. She was still wearing her white cotton nightgown, but Clay's trained eye immediately noticed the tears in the fabric and the dark stains that could only be blood. Sarah's blonde hair was tangled, and there were bruises on her thin arms that made Clay's stomach turn cold. But it was the bed that told the real story. Ezra McKinnon's bed, with its hand-carved headboard and the quilt his late wife had stitched, was a chaos of twisted sheets and disturbing evidence. The pillowcase was torn. There were clear bloodstains on the mattress, and scattered on the floor around the bed were items that no child should ever have had to see. When Sarah had turned to face him, Clay had seen something in her blue eyes that would haunt him for the rest of his life. It was the look of innocence that had been stolen, of trust that had been shattered beyond repair. And when she'd spoken, her voice had been so small and frightened that Clay had to kneel down to hear her properly. "Sheriff Hartwell," she'd whispered, "Grandpa said it's our secret, but Tommy says secrets that hurt aren't good secrets, and this one hurts real bad." Clay had been a lawman long enough to recognize a crime scene, and he'd been a human being. Long enough to understand when a child was in desperate need of protection. But he'd never faced a situation where those two realities collided so catastrophically with everything he thought he knew about his community. Standing in that bedroom, looking at the evidence of what had clearly been a violent assault on a child, Clay had felt his world shift on its axis. The man he'd respected for 20 years, the man who'd helped build this town and shape its values, the man who represented everything good and decent about frontier civilization, had committed an act so evil that Clay's mind initially refused to accept it. But Sarah's torn nightgown didn't lie. The blood on the sheets didn't lie. And the look in that little girl's eyes, that terrible knowing look that no 8-year-old should ever have to wear, that didn't lie either. Ezra McKinnon, the most respected man in Millbrook Creek, had hurt his own granddaughter in ways that would mark her for life. And now Clay Hartwell, who'd sworn an oath to protect and serve this community, had to decide what justice looked like when the guilty party was the very foundation upon which their town had been built. Clay's first instinct had been to get Sarah out of that room immediately. He'd wrapped her in a clean blanket from the hallway closet and carried her downstairs to the front parlor, away from the scene that would forever be burned into his memory. Tommy Fletcher had been waiting on the porch, wringing his hands and looking like he might be sick. "Tommy, I need you to run fetch Dr. Morrison," Clay had said, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his chest. "Tell him to come to the McKinnon house right away, and tell him to bring his medical bag. Can you do that for me?" The boy had nodded and sprinted off toward the doctor's office, leaving Clay alone with Sarah in the parlor, where so many pleasant evenings had been spent discussing town business and sharing neighborly conversation. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was now sitting in Ezra McKinnon's own chair, holding the man's granddaughter while trying to comprehend the magnitude of what had happened under this very roof. Sarah had remained quiet for several minutes, curled up in the blanket and staring at the fireplace where cold ashes lay from the previous night's fire. Clay had waited patiently, understanding that she would speak when she was ready. His experience with frightened witnesses had taught him that pushing too hard, too fast, often caused more harm than good. When she finally did speak, her words came out in a whisper so soft that Clay had to lean forward to catch them. "He said it was because I'm special," Sarah had said, not looking at Clay but keeping her eyes fixed on those cold ashes. "He said granddaughters who are extra good deserve extra attention, and that's why he gave me the pretty silver locket. He said good granddaughters keep secrets for their grandpas, especially secrets about how much he loves me." Clay's hands had clenched involuntarily, but he'd kept his voice gentle and encouraging. "Can you tell me about the locket, Sarah?" She'd reached under the blanket and pulled out a small silver locket on a delicate chain. Clay recognized it immediately. It had belonged to Ezra's late wife, Margaret, and was considered one of the family's most precious heirlooms. Inside the locket were tiny photographs of Ezra and Margaret from their wedding day, pictures that had been taken back in St. Louis before they'd made the journey west. "He gave it to me last month," Sarah had continued, her small fingers turning the locket over and over. "He said it meant I was the most special girl in the whole world, more special than any of the other girls in town. He said wearing it meant I belonged to him in a way that was different from how other granddaughters belonged to their grandpas." The implications of those words had made Clay feel sick, but he'd forced himself to remain calm and supportive. Children who had been hurt needed to feel safe before they could tell their stories, and Sarah was clearly struggling with feelings of confusion and shame that she was far too young to understand. "Sarah, I want you to know that nothing that happened to you was your fault," Clay had said firmly, "and I want you to know that it's good that you're telling me about it. Sometimes grown-ups do things they shouldn't do, even grown-ups that we love and trust. When that happens, it's important to tell someone who can help." Dr. Morrison had arrived within 15 minutes, a distinguished man in his 60s, whose gentle manner and competent care had delivered half the babies in Millbrook Creek and treated everything from broken bones to frontier diseases. Clay had briefly explained the situation, watching the doctor's face grow grave as the reality sank in. The medical examination had confirmed Clay's worst fears. Dr. Morrison's findings, recorded in careful medical language, painted a picture of systematic abuse that had been going on for weeks, possibly months. The physical evidence was undeniable, and the doctor's professional assessment left no room for doubt or alternative interpretation. But it was Sarah's continued testimony, given in the privacy of Dr. Morrison's office, while Clay waited in the outer room, that revealed the true scope of what had been happening. According to the doctor's subsequent report, Sarah had described a pattern of abuse that had begun with seemingly innocent grandfather-granddaughter activities, special outings, private talks, small gifts that were just between us. Ezra had been careful and methodical, building trust and creating situations where his behavior seemed normal and loving. He'd convinced Sarah that their special relationship was proof of how much he cared about her, and that keeping their special secrets was a way of protecting that relationship from people who might not understand. The manipulation had been sophisticated and deliberate. Ezra had used his position as the family patriarch and community leader to create an environment where questioning his behavior would have been unthinkable. He'd isolated Sarah emotionally while maintaining the appearance of being a devoted grandfather, and he'd used her natural desire to please adults and maintain family harmony as weapons against her own well-being. Clay had seen enough criminal behavior to recognize the signs of a predator who had refined his methods over time. This wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment or a single incident born of stress or desperation. This was calculated abuse carried out by someone who understood exactly what he was doing and had carefully planned how to get away with it. But the most disturbing revelation had come when Dr. Morrison had quietly suggested that they should examine whether Sarah might not be Ezra's only victim. The doctor's experience with abuse cases in other towns had taught him that men who victimized children rarely stopped with just one, and Ezra's position in the community would have given him access to many vulnerable children over the years. "I've been thinking about some things I've seen over the years," Dr. Morrison had said, his voice heavy with regret. "Injuries that didn't quite match the explanations I was given. Children who seemed unusually fearful around certain adults. Families who suddenly decided to move away from Millbrook Creek without much warning. At the time, I told myself I was being suspicious without cause. Now I'm wondering if I should have asked harder questions." As the afternoon wore on, Clay had found himself facing a reality that challenged everything he thought he knew about. Justice, community, and his own responsibility as a lawman. Sarah McKinnon wasn't just the victim of a terrible crime. She was the key to exposing what might be decades of abuse that had been hidden behind Ezra McKinnon's reputation and the community's unwillingness to question their most respected citizen. By evening, Clay had made his decision. He would investigate Ezra McKinnon with the same thoroughness he would bring to investigating any other suspected criminal, regardless of the man's standing in the community or the disruption it might cause. Sarah McKinnon deserved justice, and if there were other victims out there, they deserved justice too. But as Clay sat in his office that night, staring at the leather-bound journal he'd taken from Ezra's bedroom, he knew that seeking that justice might destroy everything he'd spent 20 years helping to build. The journal was filled with what appeared to be normal daily entries about business dealings and community activities, but Clay had begun to notice subtle patterns and coded language that suggested there was much more hidden beneath the surface. Millbrook Creek was about to learn that sometimes the price of doing what's right is higher than anyone wants to pay. Clay began his investigation the next morning by doing what any good lawman would do. He started asking questions. But in a town like Millbrook Creek, where everyone knew everyone else's business and gossip traveled faster than wildfire, asking questions about Ezra McKinnon without raising suspicion required the kind of delicate maneuvering that Clay had never needed to master before. His first stop was the schoolhouse, where Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield had been teaching Millbrook Creek's children for the past 8 years. Eleanor was a spinster in her 40s who'd come west from Boston after her father's death, carrying with her a dedication to education and a sharp intelligence that had earned the respect of every family. In town, if anyone would have noticed unusual behavior patterns among the children, it would be Eleanor. Clay found her grading papers in the empty classroom, her grey hair pulled back in its usual neat bun, her wire-rimmed spectacles perched on the end of her nose as she worked by the light of the afternoon sun streaming through the windows. "Mrs. Whitfield," Clay said, removing his hat as he entered, "I hope I'm not disturbing you, but I was wondering if I might ask you a few questions about some of the children in town." Eleanor looked up from her papers, and Clay caught something in her expression, a flicker of wariness that suggested she might already know more than she was letting on. "What kind of questions, Sheriff?" Clay had prepared his approach carefully. "I've been noticing that some families have left Millbrook Creek rather suddenly over the years, often without much explanation. I'm trying to understand if there might be some common factor that's causing good families to pull up stakes and move on. Have you noticed any patterns among the children whose families have left?" The question hung in the air for a long moment, while Eleanor studied Clay's face with the same intensity she brought to examining her student's work. Finally, she set down her pen and folded her hands on the desk. Sheriff Hartwell, in my 8 years here, I've seen 7 families leave Millbrook Creek suddenly, always with vague explanations about opportunities elsewhere or family obligations. In 6 of those cases, the family had a daughter between the ages of 7 and 12. In 5 of those cases, the daughter had been spending increased amounts of time with certain respected members of our community in the months before the family's departure. Clay felt his pulse quicken. Certain respected members? Eleanor's eyes never left his face. Mr. McKinnon has always been very generous with his time and attention to the children of this town. Many parents have been grateful for his willingness to provide special guidance and mentorship to their daughters. He's helped them with their lessons, taken them on educational outings, given them small gifts to encourage their development. The words were carefully chosen, but Clay could hear the underlying tension in Eleanor's voice. She was a woman who'd spent years observing children and adults alike, and she'd clearly noticed things that had made her uncomfortable. Mrs. Whitfield, have any of the children ever said anything to you? Anything that might have seemed unusual or concerning? Eleanor stood and walked to the window, looking out at the schoolyard where children played during recess every day. 3 years ago, little Mary Patterson asked me if it was normal for grandfathers to give special baths to their granddaughters. 2 years ago, Susan Fletcher wanted to know if she should tell her parents when an adult asked her to keep secrets. Last year, Amy Morrison seemed unusually fearful whenever Mr. McKinnon came to visit the school. Clay's heart sank as he realized the scope of what Eleanor was describing. What did you tell them? I told them to always trust their feelings and to talk to their parents about anything that made them uncomfortable. Within a month of each of those conversations, the families had left town. Eleanor turned back to face Clay, and her expression was grave. Sheriff, I've been keeping informal records of these incidents in my personal journal, not because I had proof of wrongdoing, but because something felt wrong. I just didn't know what to do with my suspicions. Clay spent the next hour looking through Eleanor's carefully kept notes, finding a pattern of concerning behavior that stretched back to her very first year in Millbrook Creek. She'd documented children's questions, behavioral changes, and family departures with the methodical attention to detail that made her such an effective teacher. But what struck Clay most was the silver locket that Eleanor produced from her desk drawer, a locket identical to the one Sarah McKinnon was wearing, right down to the photographs inside. Amy Morrison left this behind when her family moved away, Eleanor explained. She said Mr. McKinnon had given it to her as a reward for being such a good student, but she didn't want to take it with her to their new home. I kept it, thinking perhaps I might return it to Mr. McKinnon, but something made me hesitate. Clay examined the locket carefully, noting that the photographs inside were the same wedding portraits of Ezra and Margaret McKinnon that appeared in Sarah's locket. The realization that Ezra had been giving identical, special gifts to multiple young girls over the years was damning evidence of a systematic pattern of grooming behavior. That evening, Clay made discreet visits to 2 other families in town, asking general questions about their children's activities and their interactions with community leaders. He was careful not to mention Ezra specifically, instead framing his questions around general safety and security concerns. But what he learned confirmed his worst fears. The Hendersons mentioned that their 9-year-old daughter had seemed unusually attached to Mr. McKinnon recently, and that he'd been taking her on special outings to teach her about the town's history. The Coopers noted that their 8-year-old had been asking uncomfortable questions about adult behavior, and that she'd recently received an expensive gift from a secret admirer who'd asked her not to tell her parents. By the time Clay returned home to Martha that night, he was carrying the weight of knowledge that no lawman should have to bear alone. His wife took one look at his face and knew that something serious was troubling him. "Clay, what's wrong?" Martha asked, setting aside her sewing as he slumped into his chair by the fireplace. Clay looked at his wife of 25 years. This strong woman who'd stood by him through cattle rustlers and drunken cowboys and all the ordinary dangers of frontier law enforcement. How could he tell her that the man they'd invited to Sunday dinner just last month, the man who'd baptized their own children, was a predator who'd been hiding his true nature behind a mask of respectability? "Martha, I need you to promise me something," Clay said finally. "If I tell you something that's going to be hard to hear, will you trust that I wouldn't tell you unless it was absolutely necessary?" Martha set down her sewing completely and gave Clay her full attention. After 25 years of marriage to a lawman, she'd learned to recognize the signs that her husband was dealing with something more serious than routine law enforcement. "Of course, Clay. What is it?" Clay took a deep breath and told her everything. About Sarah McKinnon, about the evidence he'd found, about Eleanor Whitfield's records and the pattern of families leaving town. He watched Martha's face change as the implications sank in, saw the same shocked disbelief that he'd experienced when he'd first understood what was happening. When he finished, Martha sat in silence for several minutes, processing the information and its implications for their community. Finally she spoke, her voice quiet but determined. "What do you need me to do?" It was exactly the response Clay had hoped for and expected from the woman who'd chosen to build a life with him on the frontier. Martha McKinnon Hartwell wasn't the kind of woman who would choose comfortable ignorance over difficult truth, even when that truth threatened to tear apart everything they'd helped build. "I need you to start paying attention to how the children in town interact with certain adults," Clay said. "And I need you to be ready for the fact that when this comes out, there are going to be people in this town who would rather blame us for stirring up trouble than face the truth about what's been happening." Martha reached across and took Clay's hand, her touch warm and steadying. "Clay, you've been protecting this community for 20 years. If you tell me that someone in this town has been hurting children, then I believe you, and I'll support whatever you need to do about it." As they sat together in the firelight, Clay felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. Like a heavy coat, tomorrow he would have to continue his investigation, knowing that each piece of evidence he uncovered would bring him closer to a confrontation that would change Millbrook Creek forever. Clay knew that he couldn't conduct a thorough investigation without eventually involving the town's leadership, but he also knew that approaching them required careful strategy. Millbrook Creek's town council consisted of 5 prominent citizens, all of whom had worked closely with Ezra McKinnon for decades and owed much of their current prosperity to his guidance and support. Mayor Harold Brennan was Ezra's oldest friend and business partner, a man who'd arrived in Millbrook Creek just 2 years after Ezra and had built his own fortune by following Ezra's business advice. Judge Cornelius Stone had been practicing law in the territory for 30 years and considered Ezra one of his most trusted advisors on matters of community policy. The other 3 council members, banker Thomas Wright, merchant Samuel Foster, and rancher Jacob Murphy, all owed significant portions of their success to business relationships with Ezra. Clay decided to approach Mayor Brennan first, hoping that their long-standing working relationship might make him more receptive to hearing difficult truths. He found Brennan in his office above the bank, reviewing ledgers and preparing for the next day's council meeting. "Harold, I need to speak with you about a sensitive matter," Clay began, closing the office door behind him and taking a seat across. From the mayor's desk, Brennan looked up from his paperwork, his weathered face showing mild curiosity. "What's on your mind, Clay?" "I've been investigating some concerning incidents involving children in our community. I have reason to believe that someone in a position of trust and authority has been—" Clay paused, choosing his words carefully, "taking advantage of that position in ways that are harmful to the children involved." The change in Brennan's expression was immediate and noticeable. His eyebrows drew together, and his voice took on a defensive edge. "That's a serious accusation, Clay. I hope you have solid evidence before you start spreading rumors that could damage innocent people's reputations." "I do have evidence," Clay replied calmly. "Physical evidence, medical evidence, and testimony from multiple sources. I'm not making wild accusations. I'm conducting a proper investigation into credible allegations of criminal behavior." Brennan leaned back in his chair, studying Clay with the same careful attention he brought to evaluating loan applications. "Who are we talking about, Clay?" Clay had known this moment would come, but speaking Ezra's name aloud in this context still felt like crossing a line that could never be uncrossed. "Harold, the evidence points to Ezra McKinnon." The silence that followed was deafening. Brennan's face went through a series of changes: surprise, disbelief, anger, and finally something that looked almost like fear. "Clay, you can't be serious," Brennan said finally. "Ezra McKinnon is the most respected man in this territory. He's helped build everything we have here. The idea that he would—" Brennan shook his head vigorously. "No, I won't believe it. There has to be some mistake." Clay had expected this reaction, but it was still disheartening to see his friend's immediate impulse to protect Ezra rather than consider the possibility that children might be in danger. "Harold, I understand how difficult this is to accept. It's difficult for me too, but the evidence is clear, and my responsibility is to the safety of the children in this community, not to protecting anyone's reputation." Brennan stood and walked to his office window, looking down at the main street where Ezra's influence was visible in nearly every building and business. "Clay, you need to think very carefully about what you're suggesting. Ezra McKinnon isn't just another citizen of this town. He is this town. His reputation is tied to everything we've built here. If you make accusations like this without absolute proof, you could destroy not just him, but all of us." The words stung because Clay could hear the truth in them. Millbrook Creek's prosperity, its stability, its very identity were all intertwined with Ezra McKinnon's legacy. Attacking Ezra meant attacking the foundation of everything the community had worked to achieve. "Harold, what if the accusations are true?" Clay asked quietly. "What if there are children who have been hurt? And we've all been looking the other way because it was easier than facing an uncomfortable truth." Brennan turned back to face Clay, and his expression had hardened into something that looked more like a warning than friendly advice. "Clay, you've been a good sheriff, and this town has been grateful for your service, but you need to be very careful about pursuing this path. There are a lot of people in this community who depend on stability and order for their livelihoods. If you start making wild accusations against our most respected citizens based on flimsy evidence, you might find that the town council feels it needs to reconsider whether you're the right person to continue serving as sheriff." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Brennan was telling Clay that pursuing the investigation could cost him his job, his livelihood, and his standing in the community. It was the kind of pressure that had probably silenced other potential whistleblowers over the years. But Clay had spent too many years wearing the badge to be intimidated by political threats, especially when the safety of children was at stake. "Harold, I took an oath to uphold the law and protect the citizens of this community. That includes the most vulnerable citizens, the children who can't protect themselves. I'm going to do my job, regardless of the political consequences." Clay left the mayor's office knowing that he'd probably just made his first enemy in what was likely to become a much larger conflict. But he also left with valuable information. Brennan's reaction had confirmed that the town's leadership would prioritize protecting Ezra over protecting the children he'd victimized. Over the next several days, Clay continued his investigation, but now he was operating under the shadow of official disapproval. Word had clearly gotten around to the other council members because Clay began noticing subtle changes in how he was treated by the town's prominent citizens. Conversations that would normally be friendly and open became strained and formal. Business owners who usually greeted him warmly now seemed uncomfortable in his presence, but the investigation itself was yielding disturbing results. Eleanor Whitfield had introduced Clay to Agnes Murphy, a woman in her late 20s who'd been one of the children who'd left Millbrook Creek suddenly with her family nearly 20 years ago. Agnes had returned to visit the territory on business and had agreed to speak with Clay privately about her experiences. What Agnes told him confirmed his worst fears about the scope and duration of Ezra's crimes. She described years of abuse that had begun when she was 7 years old and continued until her family's sudden departure when she was 11. The abuse had followed the same pattern Clay was seeing with Sarah. The special attention, the gifts, the gradually increasing violations of boundaries, all justified as expressions of grandfatherly love and kept secret through a combination of manipulation and implied threats. Agnes had never told her parents the full truth about why she'd become so fearful and withdrawn during their last months in Millbrook Creek. Like Sarah, she'd been convinced that the abuse was somehow her fault and that revealing it would bring shame on her family and destroy the community's respect for her father. "I've spent 17 years trying to forget what happened in this town," Agnes told Clay as they sat in Eleanor's parlor, speaking in voices barely above whispers. "But when Mrs. Whitfield wrote to tell me what was happening to Sarah McKinnon, I knew I had to come back. That little girl shouldn't have to carry this secret alone the way I did." Agnes had brought with her a silver locket identical to Sarah's, a special gift that Ezra had given her to mark her status as one of his chosen victims. But more importantly, she'd brought the names and locations of 2 other families who'd left Millbrook Creek under similar circumstances, families whose daughters might have similar stories to tell. As Clay compiled his growing collection of evidence, the lockets, Eleanor's records, Agnes's testimony, Dr. Morrison's medical findings, he realized that he was documenting not just individual crimes, but a systematic pattern of abuse that had been going on for decades. Ezra McKinnon hadn't just hurt Sarah McKinnon. He'd likely hurt dozens of children over the years, all while maintaining his position as the town's most respected and trusted leader. But with each piece of evidence Clay gathered, the opposition to his investigation grew stronger. Town council meetings were being held without his knowledge, and he'd begun hearing rumors that certain council members were discussing the possibility of removing him from office for conduct detrimental to community harmony. The message was clear. Millbrook Creek's leadership would rather sacrifice their sheriff than confront the truth about their founding father. Clay was beginning to understand that seeking justice for Sarah McKinnon and the other victims wouldn't just require gathering evidence and making arrests. It would require fighting a battle against an entire system that had been designed to protect men like Ezra McKinnon at the expense of the children they victimized. Standing in his office that evening, looking at the official town council minutes that documented Ezra's involvement in every major decision made in Millbrook Creek for the past 30 years, Clay realized that he wasn't just investigating a criminal. He was challenging the very power structure that held his community together. The question now was whether he had the courage to see that challenge through to its conclusion, knowing that success might mean destroying the town he'd spent 20 years protecting. Clay's investigation took on new urgency when he began uncovering evidence that the pattern of abuse stretched back even further than he'd initially suspected. Eleanor Whitfield had put him in contact with Mrs. Catherine Wells, now in her 60s, who'd served as Millbrook Creek's unofficial record keeper during the town's earliest years. Catherine had maintained detailed logs of births, deaths, marriages, and family movements, information that proved invaluable in tracking the mysterious departures that had puzzled Clay. Sitting in Catherine's tidy parlor, surrounded by carefully organized boxes of documents and correspondence, Clay learned that families had been leaving Millbrook Creek suddenly and without adequate explanation for nearly 3 decades. The pattern was always the same. Families with young daughters would suddenly announce plans to relocate, often citing vague opportunities elsewhere or family obligations that required immediate attention. "I always thought it was peculiar," Catherine said, adjusting her spectacles as she pulled out a worn ledger filled with her careful handwriting. 15 families over the years, all of them established and prosperous, all of them with daughters between the ages of 6 and 13. They'd pack up their belongings within days of announcing their departure, often selling their property at significant losses just to get away quickly. Clay studied the names and dates that Catherine had meticulously recorded. The Morrison family, in 1851, left suddenly after their daughter Amy began having nightmares and refused to attend church services. The Patterson family, in 1854, departed within a week of their daughter Mary, asking uncomfortable questions about adult behavior. The Fletcher family, in 1857, sold their successful grain mill at half its value and moved to California after their daughter Susan became withdrawn and fearful. But it was the entry from 1847 that made Clay's blood run cold. The Walsh family, consisting of parents Michael and Rose and their 8-year-old daughter Emma, had left Millbrook Creek just 2 months after Ezra McKinnon had volunteered to provide special tutoring to help Emma with her reading difficulties. "I remember Emma Walsh," Catherine said softly. "Sweet child with bright red hair and freckles. She was having trouble keeping up with the other children in their lessons, and Mr. McKinnon offered to work with her privately to help her catch up. Her parents were so grateful for his generosity." Clay felt sick as he realized what Catherine was describing. Even 30 years ago, when Millbrook Creek was barely more than a collection of wooden buildings and optimistic dreams, Ezra McKinnon had been using his position of respect and authority to gain access to vulnerable children. "Mrs. Wells, do you remember anything unusual about Emma's behavior before her family left?" Catherine nodded slowly. She stopped coming to the community gatherings. Her mother said she'd been having stomach troubles and wasn't feeling well enough to be around people. "But I saw her once at the general store with her mother, and she looked—" Catherine paused, searching for the right words. "She looked like a child who'd seen something that frightened her terribly. When Mr. McKinnon came into the store while they were there, Emma hid behind her mother's skirts and wouldn't come out until he left." Clay spent the afternoon going through Catherine's records, finding reference after reference to young girls who'd exhibited behavioral changes before their families' sudden departures. The documentation was fragmentary, but the pattern was unmistakable. For 3 decades, Ezra McKinnon had been preying on the children of Millbrook Creek, and for 3 decades, families had chosen to flee rather than confront the truth about what was happening to their daughters. The most heartbreaking discovery came when Catherine produced a small wooden box containing letters and personal items that various families had left behind in their haste to depart. Among these items was a child's diary, written in the careful script of a young girl who was clearly struggling to make sense of experiences that no child should have to endure. The diary belonged to Mary Patterson, and its final entries described the same pattern of grooming and abuse that Clay was seeing with Sarah McKinnon. But what made Mary's story particularly tragic was her final entry, dated just 3 days before her family's departure. "I tried to tell Mama about what Grandpa Ezra does during our special lessons, but she got angry and said I mustn't make up stories about such a good man. She said if I keep telling lies, people will think our family is ungrateful for all the help Mr. McKinnon has given us. I don't know what to do. Maybe I am making it up. Maybe it's normal for grandpas to do these things with special granddaughters. I just wish it didn't hurt so much and make me feel so scared." Clay had to stop reading and step outside for fresh air. The realization that these children had been carrying their trauma alone, without support or validation from the adults who should have protected them, was almost more than he could bear. When he returned to Catherine's parlor, she was holding a bronze plaque that Clay recognized immediately. It was the dedication plaque from St. Matthew's Church, commemorating Ezra McKinnon's generous donation for the church bell that called the faithful to worship every Sunday morning. "The irony isn't lost on me," Catherine said quietly. "Every Sunday, that bell rings to call our community to worship in a church built with money donated by a man who's been preying on our children for 30 years. It's enough to make a person question everything they thought they knew about righteousness and evil." The church bell dedication had taken place in 1852, with great ceremony and speeches about Ezra's moral leadership and generous spirit. The plaque bore an inscription that now seemed bitterly ironic. "In recognition of Ezra McKinnon's generous donation and moral leadership, may this bell call our community to righteousness for generations to come." Clay realized that the plaque represented something more than just bitter irony. It was a symbol of how completely Ezra had manipulated the community's perception of morality and righteousness. By positioning himself as a moral leader and generous benefactor, he'd created a situation where questioning his behavior felt like questioning the very foundations of the community's values. That evening, Clay met with Agnes Murphy in Eleanor's parlor to share what he'd learned from Catherine's records. Agnes listened to the historical evidence with the grim recognition of someone who understood exactly what it meant. "Sheriff, what you're describing isn't just individual crimes," Agnes said. "This is systematic predation that's been protected by a conspiracy of silence and denial that goes back decades. Every family that left town rather than confront what was happening helped enable him to continue hurting other children." Agnes had spent years trying to heal from her own trauma, and her adult perspective allowed her to see patterns that had been invisible to her as a child. She explained how Ezra's method of operation had been sophisticated and calculated, designed to exploit not just the children themselves, but the social dynamics of the entire community. "He chose his victims carefully," Agnes continued. "Children from families who were grateful to him, who depended on his support, who couldn't afford to make enemies of the town's most powerful man. He made sure that each family faced the same impossible choice: protect their child and destroy their place in the community, or stay silent and hope the problem would go away on its own." Agnes had agreed to help Clay contact some of the other families who'd left Millbrook Creek under suspicious circumstances. Using her connections and the network of people who'd maintained correspondence over the years, she'd managed to locate 3 other former residents who'd been children during the periods when their families had departed suddenly. 2 of these women had agreed to travel back to Millbrook Creek to meet with Clay and share their stories. Their testimonies would provide the kind of corroborating evidence that would make it impossible for the community to continue denying the truth about Ezra McKinnon. But as Clay prepared for these crucial interviews, he was also dealing with increasing pressure from the town's leadership to abandon his investigation. Mayor Brennan had made it clear that the town council was losing patience with what they saw as Clay's obsession with discrediting a respected citizen based on unsubstantiated rumors. Judge Cornelius Stone had been more direct in his criticism. During a tense conversation outside the courthouse, Stone had told Clay that his investigation was threatening the stability of the entire legal system in Millbrook Creek. "Clay, you're creating a situation where people are going to start questioning the judgment and integrity of every authority figure in this town," Stone had warned. "Once you open these kinds of doubts, where does it end? Will people start questioning my decisions as a judge? Will they start wondering if the mayor has been hiding secrets? You're undermining the very foundations of civil order." The judge's concerns weren't entirely without merit. Clay's investigation was forcing the community to confront the possibility that their most trusted institutions and leaders had been protecting a predator for decades. The implications went far beyond Ezra's individual crimes to touch on fundamental questions about power, authority, and the willingness of good people to look the other way when confronting evil became inconvenient. But as Clay walked home that Evening, passing the church where Ezra's donated bell tower rose against the darkening sky, he knew that there was no turning back. Sarah McKinnon and all the other victims deserved more than a community's willingness to protect comfortable lies at the expense of painful truths. The question now wasn't whether Clay would continue his investigation, but whether he could gather enough evidence and support to ensure that justice would finally be served, even if it meant watching his beloved community tear itself apart in the process. The breaking point came when Clay discovered that Ezra's influence extended far beyond Millbrook Creek's borders. While searching through the papers in Ezra's study, documents he'd secured as evidence after obtaining a proper search warrant from a territorial judge in the county seat, Clay found correspondence that revealed a disturbing network of communication with officials in neighboring towns and territorial authorities. The telegraph key in Ezra's study wasn't just used for normal business communications. Clay found copies of telegrams dating back several years that showed Ezra had been exchanging information with corrupt officials in other settlements, sharing what appeared to be coded intelligence about troublesome families and disruptive investigations that needed to be managed carefully. One telegram from 1869 was particularly damning. It was addressed to a territorial judge in Silver Ridge, a town about 50 miles north of Millbrook Creek, and read, "Patterson matter resolved. Through relocation, family departed quietly. Suggest similar approach for your Henderson situation. Discretion maintains community stability. E.M." Clay realized that Ezra hadn't just been covering up his crimes in Millbrook Creek. He'd been part of a larger network of corrupt officials who were helping each other avoid accountability for similar crimes in their own jurisdictions. The systematic nature of the corruption was staggering, but the most disturbing discovery came when Clay found evidence that some of Millbrook Creek's own leaders weren't just enablers, but active participants in Ezra's crimes. A series of coded letters between Ezra and Judge Cornelius Stone revealed that Stone had been helping to suppress legal complaints and ensure that certain cases never made it to court. One letter from Stone to Ezra, dated just 6 months earlier, made Clay's stomach turn. "The Morrison matter has been handled as discussed. The family has been convinced that pursuing formal complaints would be detrimental to their standing in the community. Dr. Morrison's medical records have been sealed pending further investigation that will, of course, never be completed. Your generosity to the courthouse renovation fund has been noted and appreciated. C.S. Clay realized that Dr. Morrison, the same doctor who'd examined Sarah and documented the evidence of her abuse, had been pressured to suppress his findings about other victims in the past. The corruption went deeper than Clay had imagined, involving not just community leaders who looked the other way, but officials who actively participated in covering up crimes against children. Armed with this new evidence, Clay made a decision that he knew would change everything. He couldn't trust the local authorities to handle this case properly, so he would have to go outside Millbrook Creek's power structure entirely. He composed a detailed letter to the Territorial Marshal's office, requesting federal intervention in what was clearly a case of systematic corruption involving multiple jurisdictions. But before he could send the letter, Mayor Brennan arrived at Clay's office with 3 other town council members, their faces grim with determination. "Clay, we need to talk," Brennan said, his voice carrying the weight of official authority. "The town council met in emergency session last night, and we've reached a decision about your recent activities." Clay looked at the 4 men, Brennan, merchant Samuel Foster, banker Thomas Wright, and rancher Jacob Murphy, and saw the kind of resolve that came from men who'd made a difficult decision and were prepared to follow through on it. "We've been impatient with your investigation," Foster continued, "but it's become clear that you're more interested in destroying this community than protecting it. Your accusations against Mr. McKinnon are based on nothing but rumors and speculation, and they're causing panic and division among decent, God-fearing families." Wright stepped forward, holding an official-looking document. "The town council has voted to suspend you from your duties as sheriff, effective immediately. We're appointing Deputy Marshal Frank Collins as interim sheriff until we can arrange for proper elections." Clay had been expecting this moment, but it still hit him like a physical blow. Frank Collins was a young man who'd been hired as a deputy just 2 years ago, someone with good intentions but no experience dealing with complex criminal investigations or corrupt authority figures. "You're making a mistake," Clay said quietly. "The evidence I've gathered proves that Ezra McKinnon has been systematically abusing children for decades, and that some of you have been helping him cover it up. Removing me from office won't make that evidence disappear." Murphy, who'd been silent up to this point, finally spoke. "Clay, you've been a good sheriff for 20 years, but you've lost perspective on this situation. Mr. McKinnon is a pillar of this community. The idea that he would hurt children is not just unlikely, it's impossible. Good men don't do evil things, and evil men don't spend 30 years building churches and schools and helping families prosper." The simplicity of Murphy's worldview would have been touching if it weren't so dangerous. Like many frontier settlers, Murphy had built his understanding of morality around the idea that good and evil were easily distinguishable, that righteous people were obviously righteous and wicked people were obviously wicked. Clay realized that this was exactly the kind of thinking that had allowed Ezra to operate for so long. By presenting himself as obviously good, generous, helpful, morally upstanding, Ezra had made it psychologically difficult for people to believe he could also be evil. "Jacob, I understand why this is hard to accept," Clay said. "It's hard for me too. But the evidence doesn't lie. Children have been hurt, and they deserve justice, even if that justice is inconvenient for the rest of us." Brennan held out his hand expectantly. "Clay, I need your badge and your gun. Deputy Collins will take over your duties immediately." As Clay unpinned the badge he'd worn for 20 years and handed it to the mayor, he felt the weight of everything he was giving up. This badge represented not just his job, but his identity, his purpose, and his standing in the community he'd served faithfully for 2 decades. But as he looked at the men who were removing him from office, men who were choosing comfort over truth, reputation over justice, Clay realized that keeping the badge would have meant betraying everything it was supposed to represent. "Harold, you're making the biggest mistake in this town's history," Clay said, as he handed over his gun. "Those children deserved better from all of us, and someday you're going to have to live with the knowledge that you chose to protect their abuser instead of protecting them." After the town council members left, Clay sat alone in the office that was no longer his, looking at the evidence he'd spent weeks gathering. Evidence that would now likely be destroyed or suppressed by men who were more concerned with maintaining order than ensuring justice. But Clay wasn't ready to give up. He still had allies in Eleanor Whitfield and Agnes Murphy, and he still had contacts outside Millbrook Creek who might be willing to listen to the truth, even if his own community wasn't. That evening, Martha found Clay sitting on their front porch, staring at the sunset and contemplating his next move. She sat down beside him and took his hand, offering the kind of quiet support that had sustained him through 20 years of law enforcement. "They took my badge today," Clay said simply. Martha nodded. "I heard. Half the town's talking about it. The other half is pretending nothing happened." Clay looked at his wife, this strong woman who'd stood by him through everything frontier life had thrown at them. "Martha, I could let this go. We could pack up and move somewhere else, start over. I could find work as a sheriff in some other town where the corruption doesn't run quite so deep." Martha was quiet for several minutes, considering the offer and all its implications. Finally, she squeezed Clay's hand and gave him her answer. "Clay Hartwell, in 25 years of marriage, you've never walked away from doing what's right just because it was hard. I don't expect you to start now, especially when there are children, depending on someone being brave enough to speak for them. Clay felt a surge of gratitude for the woman who'd chosen to build a life with him on the frontier. Martha's support didn't make the road ahead any easier, but it made the journey feel possible. As they sat together on the porch, watching the last light fade from the sky, Clay began planning his next move. He might not have a badge anymore, but he still had evidence. He still had allies, and he still had the kind of stubborn determination that had carried him through 20 years of frontier law enforcement. Ezra McKinnon and his corrupt network had won this battle, but the war for justice was far from over. 3 days after losing his badge, Clay made a discovery that changed everything he thought he knew about the scope of Ezra McKinnon's crimes. Acting on information provided by Agnes Murphy, who'd managed to contact 2 other survivors from neighboring towns, Clay gained access to a hidden room in Ezra's house that even his most thorough search as sheriff had failed to uncover. The hidden room was located behind a false wall in Ezra's study, accessible through a mechanism built into the bookshelf that required pressing a specific sequence of book spines. Agnes had remembered the room from her childhood. Ezra had shown it to her as part of the grooming process, describing it as their special place where they could have privacy for their lessons. What Clay found in that room was evidence so damning and extensive that it defied comprehension. The walls were lined with carefully organized shelves containing hundreds of photographs, personal items, and detailed written records documenting decades of systematic abuse. The photographs were disturbing beyond description. Images of children from Millbrook Creek and surrounding communities, some dating back to the town's earliest days. But it was the written records that revealed the true scope of Ezra's operation. He'd kept meticulous journals documenting not just his own crimes, but a network of like-minded predators operating throughout the territory. The journals contained names, dates, locations, and detailed descriptions of abuse carried out against dozens of children over the course of 30 years. Clay realized that what he'd initially thought was one man's criminal behavior was actually part of a coordinated network of predators who'd been sharing victims' information and protection. Ezra hadn't just been abusing children in Millbrook Creek. He'd been trading victims with corrupt officials in other towns, arranging for children to be transported between communities for abuse by different members of the network. One journal entry from 1865 made Clay physically sick. Arranged transfer of the Patterson girl to Stone's custody for weekend. Colin's family daughter will be available for exchange next month. Network expansion to Silver Ridge proceeding as planned. Territorial Judge Williams fully cooperative. The systematic nature of the abuse was staggering. But even more disturbing was the realization that Ezra's network included not just local officials, but territorial authorities with jurisdiction over multiple counties. Clay found evidence that territorial judges, federal marshals, and even some military officials had been participating in or protecting the network's activities. Among the photographs, Clay found images of Sarah McKinnon that had clearly been taken without her knowledge or consent. But he also found photographs of children from other towns. Some he recognized from missing person reports that had crossed his desk over the years, cases where children had simply disappeared and were never found. The most heartbreaking discovery was a collection of personal items that had belonged to the victims. Hair ribbons, small toys, pieces of clothing that had clearly been kept as trophies. Each item was carefully labeled with a name, date, and brief description of the circumstances under which it had been obtained. But it was the discovery of a second set of journals that revealed the full extent of the conspiracy. These journals, written in Judge Stone's distinctive handwriting, documented not just his own participation in the abuse, but his efforts to coordinate the legal cover-up that had protected the network for decades. Stone's journals revealed that He'd been systematically suppressing legal complaints, intimidating witnesses, and ensuring that any evidence of the network's activities was either destroyed or sealed away where it couldn't be accessed by honest investigators. He'd used his position as a territorial judge to create a legal framework that protected predators while silencing their victims. One entry from Stone's journal was particularly damning. McKinnon's methods remain effective. Families continue to choose relocation over confrontation. Local sheriff shows concerning curiosity but lacks evidence for formal investigation. Recommend increased surveillance and preparation for potential removal if necessary. Clay realized that his own investigation hadn't gone unnoticed. Stone and Ezra had been monitoring his activities and preparing to remove him from office long before the town council had acted. His removal as sheriff hadn't been a spontaneous decision by concerned community leaders. It had been a calculated move by corrupt officials who were protecting their criminal network. But the most shocking discovery came when Clay found evidence that the network's activities weren't limited to sexual abuse. Some of the journals contained references to children who'd been permanently silenced when they'd threatened to expose the network's activities. Clay found references to at least 6 children over the years who died under suspicious circumstances after attempting to report abuse or after their families had begun asking difficult questions. The children's deaths had been carefully disguised as accidents or natural causes, with corrupt officials like Stone ensuring that investigations were either superficial or non-existent. Dr. Morrison's medical records, which Clay found copies of in the hidden room, showed clear evidence of tampering and falsification in cases. Where children had died after showing signs of abuse, Clay realized that Sarah McKinnon's life might be in immediate danger. If the network was willing to kill children to protect itself, and if they suspected that Sarah had provided testimony that could expose their activities, she could be their next target. But Clay also realized that he now had evidence that could destroy the entire network. The photographs, journals, and personal items in the hidden room provided proof not just of individual crimes, but of a coordinated conspiracy that involved officials at every level of territorial government. The evidence was so extensive and detailed that even the most corrupt authorities wouldn't be able to suppress or ignore it. Clay had found the kind of proof that could bring down not just Ezra McKinnon, but dozens of officials throughout the territory who'd been participating in or protecting the network's activities. As Clay carefully documented and catalogued the evidence in the hidden room, he began to understand the true scope of what he was facing. This wasn't just about seeking justice for Sarah McKinnon and the other victims in Millbrook Creek. It was about exposing a network of corruption and abuse that extended throughout the territorial government. But Clay also realized that possessing this evidence put his own life in danger. The network had killed children to protect itself. They wouldn't hesitate to kill a former sheriff who threatened to expose their activities. As he prepared to leave the hidden room with the most damning evidence, Clay heard footsteps in the house above. Someone was in Ezra's study, moving around. With the confident familiarity of someone who belonged there, Clay realized that he'd been discovered. The network knew he'd found their secret, and they were coming to stop him from exposing the truth. Everything he'd worked for, all the evidence he'd gathered, all the hope for justice that Sarah and the other victims deserved, it all depended on whether he could get out of that house alive with proof of the network's crimes. The final confrontation that Clay had been preparing for was about to begin, but the stakes were higher than he'd ever imagined. This wasn't just about one man's crimes in one town. It was about a conspiracy that had been destroying children's lives across the entire territory for decades. And now Clay Hartwell, former sheriff of Millbrook Creek, was the only person standing between that conspiracy and the justice that 30 years of victims deserved. Clay pressed himself against the wall of the hidden room, listening to the footsteps above as his mind raced through his options. The evidence surrounding him represented decades of systematic abuse and corruption, but it would be worthless if he couldn't get it to someone with the authority and integrity to act on it. The footsteps moved with purpose toward the study's bookshelf mechanism. Whoever was upstairs knew about the hidden room and was coming down to confront him. Clay quickly stuffed the most critical documents, Stone's journals, the network correspondence, and several of the most damning photographs, into a leather satchel he found on one of the shelves. The bookshelf mechanism began to move, and Clay heard Ezra McKinnon's voice calling down into the hidden room. "Mr. Hartwell, I know you're down there. There's no point in hiding. Come up so we can discuss this situation like civilized men." Clay's hand instinctively moved to where his gun usually hung, but his holster was empty. He'd surrendered his weapon when the town council removed him from office. He was trapped in a basement room with no weapon, facing men who'd already proven they were willing to kill to protect their secrets. "I'm not alone, Mr. Hartwell," Ezra continued, his voice carrying the same calm authority that had made him such an effective community leader for 30 years. "Judge Stone is with me, and we've brought several other concerned citizens who are worried about your recent erratic behavior. We'd prefer to resolve this matter quietly, but we're prepared to take whatever steps are necessary to protect this community from false accusations and destructive rumors." Clay realized that his former badge and gun were currently being worn by Deputy Collins, a young man who was probably completely unaware of the conspiracy he'd unknowingly become part of. The network had effectively neutralized local law enforcement by removing Clay and replacing him with someone who could be controlled or manipulated. But Clay also realized that he still had allies who were outside the network's immediate control. Eleanor Whitfield was still free and still had copies of her own documentation about suspicious incidents over the years. Agnes Murphy was still in town and still had connections to other survivors who could provide testimony. Martha was still at home, probably wondering why her husband hadn't returned for dinner. More importantly, Clay had managed to get a message to the Territorial Marshal's office before his removal from office. Marshal Samuel Richardson was a man Clay had worked with on several cases over the years, someone whose integrity and competence had earned respect throughout the territory. If Richardson received Clay's message about the corruption in Millbrook Creek, he would investigate regardless of pressure from local officials. "Mr. Hartwell, you're making this more difficult than it needs to be." Judge Stone's voice joined Ezra's from above. "You've stumbled onto information that you don't fully understand, and you're drawing conclusions that could damage innocent people's reputations. Come up now, and we can explain the real situation to you." Clay could hear other voices murmuring in the study above, at least 3 or 4 people who'd come to deal with him. He recognized Mayor Brennan's distinctive tone and possibly banker Thomas Wright's voice as well. The network's local leadership had assembled to handle what they clearly viewed as a serious threat to their operation. But Clay had spent 20 years as a lawman, and he'd learned to think strategically about dangerous situations. The hidden room had no other exit, but it did have advantages that he could use. The room was well stocked with supplies, suggesting that Ezra had planned for the possibility of needing to hide evidence or people for extended periods. More importantly, the room's existence was a secret. If Clay could get out of the house without being seen, the network wouldn't know how much evidence he'd obtained or where he'd hidden it. Clay began looking for alternative ways out of the hidden room. The room was partially underground, built into the foundation of Ezra's house. But Clay found what appeared to be a narrow ventilation shaft that led toward the back of the property. The shaft was small and would require crawling, but it might provide an escape route that his pursuers wouldn't expect. As Clay prepared to enter the ventilation shaft, he could hear the men above becoming more agitated. Their voices were rising, and he could make out fragments of their conversation that revealed the scope of their concern. "Federal Marshal asking questions," came Mayor Brennan's voice. "Too much attention from territorial authorities." Judge Stone responded, permanent solution like the Morrison situation. Ezra's voice carried a cold finality that made Clay's blood run cold. Clay realized that the network was preparing to kill him, just as they'd apparently killed other threats to their operation over the years. His investigation hadn't just uncovered their crimes. It had forced them into a position where they felt they had no choice but to eliminate him completely. But Clay also realized that the mention of a federal marshal asking questions meant that his message to Marshal Richardson had been received and was being acted upon. The network was feeling pressure from outside authorities, which meant they were becoming desperate and potentially careless. Clay began crawling through the ventilation shaft, moving as quietly as possible while the men above continued their discussion. The shaft was narrow and uncomfortable, but it was leading him away from the house and toward what he hoped would be freedom. As he crawled, Clay could hear the sound of the bookshelf mechanism being activated again. The men were coming down into the hidden room, and they would discover his escape within minutes. Clay increased his pace, ignoring the discomfort as he pushed through the narrow passage. The ventilation shaft ended at a grate that opened onto the back of Ezra's property, near the small garden shed where tools and equipment were stored. Clay pushed the grate open as quietly as possible and emerged into the evening air, grateful to be out of the confined space and back under the open sky. But Clay's relief was short-lived. As he stood up and brushed dirt from his clothes, he could hear shouts coming from inside the house. The men had discovered his escape and were spreading out to search the property. Clay could see lanterns moving around the front of the house and hear voices calling out orders. Clay realized that he needed to get to Marshal Richardson as quickly as possible. The evidence in his satchel was crucial, but it would be worthless if the network managed to kill him before he could turn it over to honest authorities. He also needed to warn Eleanor, Agnes, and Martha that the network was taking extreme measures to protect itself. But first, Clay needed to get off Ezra's property without being seen. The men searching for him knew the local area as well as he did, and they had the advantage of numbers and organization. Clay's only advantages were his experience as a lawman and his intimate knowledge of Millbrook Creek's back streets and hiding places. Clay began making his way carefully through the shadows, moving from building to building as he worked his way toward the center of town. His destination was the telegraph office, where he could send an urgent message to Marshal Richardson explaining the immediate danger and requesting emergency assistance. As he moved through the familiar streets of his hometown, Clay reflected on how completely his world had changed. 3 weeks ago, he'd been the respected sheriff of a peaceful community, dealing with routine problems and maintaining order through personal relationships and mutual respect. Tonight, he was a fugitive in his own town, carrying evidence of crimes so horrific that they challenged everything he'd believed about human nature and community values. But Clay also felt a sense of clarity and purpose that had been missing from his life for years. For the first time in decades, he was fighting for something that mattered more than maintaining order or preserving peace. He was fighting for justice for children who'd been hurt by the very adults who should have protected them. The confrontation that was coming would determine not just Clay's fate, but the fate of every child who'd been victimized by Ezra McKinnon's network. Clay's badge and gun had been taken from him, but his commitment to protecting the innocent remained stronger than ever. As he reached the telegraph office and began composing his urgent message to Marshal Richardson, Clay knew that the next few hours would determine whether 30 years of systematic abuse would finally be exposed, or whether the network's corruption would claim another victim and continue operating in the shadows. The final battle for justice in Millbrook Creek was about to begin, and Clay Hartwell was prepared to risk everything to ensure that the children who'd suffered in silence for so long would finally have someone willing to speak for them, no matter the cost. The annual Millbrook Creek Founding Day celebration was scheduled to begin at 10 o'clock the following morning, with Ezra McKinnon serving as the guest of honor and delivering the keynote speech about the town's proud history and bright future. The celebration had been planned for months, with families contributing food, musicians preparing entertainment, and children rehearsing performances to honor the community's heritage. Clay had spent the night hiding in Eleanor Whitfield's house, sharing the evidence he'd discovered and planning their strategy for the confrontation that was now inevitable. Eleanor had sent word to Agnes Murphy, and together they'd contacted Marshal Richardson, who'd responded immediately to Clay's urgent telegram with news that federal marshals were already en route to Millbrook Creek. "They'll be here by 9 o'clock, Eleanor said, reading Richardson's response by lamplight in her kitchen. "He's bringing 3 deputy marshals and has authority to make arrests for federal crimes involving corruption of territorial officials." Agnes had spent the night writing out detailed testimony about her abuse and the network's operations, creating a formal statement that could be used in federal court. She'd also managed to contact 2 other survivors who were traveling to Millbrook Creek to provide their own testimony, women who'd carried their trauma in silence for decades but were finally ready to speak the truth. "Sarah needs to know what's happening," Agnes said. "That little girl has been carrying this secret alone, and she deserves to see justice done. But more than that, she needs to know that she's not alone, that there are other survivors who understand what she's been through." Clay looked out Eleanor's kitchen window toward the town square, where workers were already setting up decorations and preparing the platform where Ezra would deliver his speech. The banner stretched across the main street read, "Celebrating 30 Years of Progress and Prosperity," and smaller banners throughout the square proclaimed Millbrook Creek's gratitude to its founding families. The irony was devastating. The town's biggest celebration would become the setting for exposing its darkest secrets, and the man being honored as the community's greatest benefactor would be revealed as its most dangerous predator. At 8:30, Clay saw the federal marshals arrive, 4 men on horseback, wearing the distinctive badges and carrying the authority of the territorial government. Marshal Richardson was exactly as Clay remembered him. A tall, lean man in his 50s, with grey hair, and the kind of steady competence that came from years of dealing with the worst kinds of human behavior. Clay met the marshals at the edge of town, away from the curious eyes of early celebration attendees. Richardson reviewed the evidence Clay had gathered, his expression growing grimmer as he examined the photographs, journals, and correspondence that documented decades of systematic abuse and corruption. "This is worse than I imagined," Richardson said finally. "We're not just dealing with individual crimes. This is a criminal conspiracy that involves officials at every level of territorial government. Some of these names," he held up one of Stone's journals, "these are men I've worked with for years, men I trusted." Richardson's deputy marshals were equally shocked by the scope of the corruption. The evidence Clay had gathered implicated not just local officials in Millbrook Creek, but territorial judges, federal marshals, and military officers throughout the region. "Marshal, what's our strategy?" Clay asked. "Ezra's scheduled to give his speech in an hour, and half the town will be gathered in the square listening to him. If we're going to arrest him publicly, we need to be prepared for the reaction." Richardson considered their options carefully. A public arrest during the town's biggest celebration would create chaos and potentially put innocent people at risk, but it would also send a clear message that the network's protection was ended and that justice would be served regardless of the perpetrator's status in the community. "We'll let him start his speech," Richardson decided. "Let the community see him in all his supposed glory, standing up there talking about progress and prosperity. Then we'll present the evidence publicly so there can be no doubt about why we're making these arrests." As they prepared for the confrontation, Clay caught sight of Sarah McKinnon walking toward the town square with her parents. The little girl was wearing her best dress and the silver locket that Ezra had given her, looking like any other child excited about a community celebration. But Clay could see the careful way she moved, the way she stayed close to her mother's. sighed, the watchful expression that no 8-year-old should have to wear. At 10 o'clock, the celebration began with the traditional ringing of the church bell, the same bell that Ezra had donated decades earlier, the same bell whose dedication plaque praised his moral leadership. Families gathered in the town square, children running between the adults while mothers laid out picnic blankets and fathers discussed business and weather. Mayor Brennan took the platform first, welcoming everyone to the celebration and praising the community's growth and prosperity over the past 30 years. He spoke about the pioneers who'd built Millbrook Creek from nothing, about the values of hard work and mutual support that had made their success possible. Then Brennan introduced Ezra McKinnon as the man who, more than anyone else, embodies the spirit and values that have made our community great. The crowd applauded enthusiastically as Ezra climbed onto the platform, his silver hair gleaming in the morning sun, his manner dignified and grandfatherly. Ezra began his speech by reflecting on the early days of Millbrook Creek, when it was nothing more than a trading post and a few tents scattered around a creek crossing. He spoke eloquently about the challenges the pioneers had faced, the sacrifices they'd made, and the dreams they'd nurtured for their children and grandchildren. 30 years ago, Ezra said, his voice carrying clearly across the crowded square, we came to this place with nothing but hope and determination. We built our homes, our businesses, our church and our school with our own hands. We created a community where children could grow up safe and protected, where families could prosper, where good values could be passed down from generation to generation. Clay felt sick listening to Ezra's words about protecting children and preserving good values, knowing what he knew about the man's true character. But he also saw that several families in the crowd were beginning to notice the federal marshals positioned around the square, and whispers were starting to spread through the gathering. Sarah McKinnon was standing with her parents near the front of the crowd, looking up at her grandfather with the complicated expression of a child who'd been taught to respect an adult who'd hurt her. Clay could see Agnes Murphy positioned near the McKinnon family, ready to provide support when the truth finally came out. Ezra continued his speech, praising the community's commitment to supporting its most vulnerable members and protecting its children from the dangers of the wider world. Each word felt like a mockery of the truth, a deliberate insult to every child he'd victimized over the decades. We've built something special here in Millbrook Creek, Ezra declared. A place where trust and respect are the foundations of all our relationships, where the innocent can rely on the protection of those with experience and wisdom. That's when Marshal Richardson stepped forward, his badge gleaming in the morning light, his voice cutting through Ezra's speech like a blade. Ezra McKinnon, Richardson called out, his voice carrying the full authority of the territorial government. You are under arrest for multiple counts of child abuse, conspiracy, corruption of public officials, and murder. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. The crowd erupted in shocked gasps, angry shouts, and confused questions. Some people rushed toward the platform, others backed away in alarm, and children began crying as they sensed the adults' distress without understanding its cause. Ezra's carefully composed expression cracked for the first time in decades. The mask of respectability and grandfatherly kindness slipped away, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. This is an outrage, Ezra declared, his voice rising above the crowd's noise. I am being persecuted by a disgraced former sheriff who has lost his mind and is seeking revenge against the community that rightfully rejected his false accusations. But Marshal Richardson was already climbing onto the platform, holding up the evidence that Clay had gathered from the hidden room. The photographs, the journals, the correspondence. All of it was being displayed for the community to see, proof that could not be denied or explained away. Ladies and gentlemen, Richardson announced. "We have extensive evidence of systematic criminal activity that has been going on in your community for 30 years. Evidence that will be presented in federal court and will result in justice for the victims who have suffered in silence for far too long." The moment of truth had arrived, and Clay watched as 30 years of carefully constructed lies began to crumble before the eyes of an entire community. Ezra McKinnon, realizing that his network of protection had finally failed him, made one last desperate attempt to maintain control of the narrative. "You fools!" Ezra shouted at the crowd, his mask of grandfatherly kindness completely gone now, replaced by the cold arrogance of a man who'd wielded power without accountability for decades. "You don't understand what you're destroying. This community exists because of what I built here. Without me, you're nothing but failed farmers and shopkeepers scratching out a living in the wilderness." The transformation was shocking. The man who'd spent 30 years presenting himself as a humble servant of the community was now revealing the contempt he'd always felt for the people he'd manipulated and controlled. Judge Cornelius Stone, seeing that their conspiracy was exposed, tried to slip away from the crowd, but one of Richardson's deputy marshals was waiting for him. Stone's arrest sparked another wave of shocked murmurs as people began to realize that the corruption extended beyond Ezra to include other trusted authority figures. Judge Stone has been systematically suppressing evidence and protecting criminal activity for over 2 decades. Marshal Richardson announced to the crowd. "We have documented proof of his participation in covering up crimes against children throughout this territory." Mayor Brennan, his face pale with shock and fear, pushed through the crowd toward the platform. "This is impossible," he declared. "Ezra McKinnon is the most respected man in this territory. Judge Stone has served this community faithfully for 30 years. These accusations are the ravings of a disgraced sheriff who's lost his mind." But Agnes Murphy stepped forward from the crowd, her voice clear and strong as she addressed the community that had failed to protect her 20 years earlier. "Mayor Brennan, my name is Agnes Murphy. I was born in this town and I lived here until I was 11 years old. Ezra McKinnon abused me for 4 years, and when I finally tried to tell my parents, they were so afraid of challenging his reputation that they packed up our family and left town rather than seek justice." Agnes's words cut through the crowds, confusion like a knife. Here was a grown woman, clearly intelligent and credible, providing specific testimony about events that many of the older residents could remember. "I'm not the only one," Agnes continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "There are other women here today who survived what Ezra McKinnon did to them when they were children. We've carried this secret for decades because we were told that protecting his reputation was more important than protecting children." Sarah McKinnon, who'd been standing quietly beside her parents, suddenly broke free from her mother's grasp and ran toward the platform. Her small voice carried clearly. Across the square as she called out to her grandfather, "Grandpa, you said it was our secret," Sarah cried, her voice breaking with the emotional weight of finally speaking the truth publicly. "You said good granddaughters keep secrets, but it hurt, Grandpa. It hurt really bad, and I didn't want it to be our secret anymore." The crowd fell, completely silent as Sarah's words sank in. Here was an 8-year-old child speaking with the unmistakable voice of truth about experiences that no child should ever have to endure. Emily McKinnon, Sarah's mother, collapsed to her knees as the full reality of what her daughter had been suffering became clear. Robert McKinnon, Ezra's son, stared at his father with an expression of horror and betrayal that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Ezra, seeing his granddaughter's public testimony and realizing that his network of lies and manipulation was finally collapsing, made a final, desperate move. He pulled a small derringer from his vest pocket and pointed it at Sarah, his eyes wild with the desperation of a cornered animal. "You little fool," he snarled at his granddaughter. "You've destroyed everything I built, everything I worked for, destroyed by the ungrateful lies of stupid children who don't understand the gifts they were given. The crowd scattered in panic as they realized that Ezra was armed and threatening a child. Parents grabbed their children and fled towards safety while the federal marshals drew their weapons and surrounded the platform. Clay, despite having no badge or official authority, couldn't stand by and watch Ezra threaten Sarah. He pushed through the panicking crowd and climbed onto the platform, placing himself between the armed man and the frightened child. "Ezra, put the gun down," Clay said calmly, his voice carrying the authority of 20 years of law enforcement experience. "You're surrounded, and there's nowhere to run. Don't make this worse by hurting an innocent child." "Innocent?" Ezra laughed bitterly. "These children aren't innocent. They're seductresses who tempt good men into sin. They deserve what they get." The words revealed the twisted thinking that had allowed Ezra to justify decades of child abuse. In his mind, he was the victim, seduced and corrupted by children who were somehow responsible for their own victimization. But Ezra's delusions couldn't protect him from the reality of his situation. Marshal Richardson and his deputies had clear shots, and Clay was close enough to act if Ezra's attention wavered for even a moment. That moment came when Eleanor Whitfield climbed onto the platform from the other side, her schoolteacher's voice, cutting through the chaos with calm authority. "Mr. McKinnon," she said firmly, "I've been documenting your crimes for 8 years, and I have enough evidence to convict you in any honest court. You can choose to surrender with whatever dignity you have left, or you can be remembered as a coward who threatened children when his lies were finally exposed." Ezra's hand wavered as he turned toward Eleanor, and in that instant of distraction, Clay lunged forward and knocked the gun from his grasp. The derringer discharged harmlessly into the air as Clay wrestled Ezra to the ground, finally ending the reign of terror that had lasted for 30 years. As the federal marshals secured Ezra in chains, his fancy walking cane the symbol of his authority and respectability, lay broken on the platform beside him, shattered in the struggle. The man who'd ruled Millbrook Creek through fear, manipulation, and carefully constructed lies was finally revealed as what he'd always been: a coward and a predator who'd hidden behind a mask of respectability. Sarah McKinnon ran into her mother's arms, finally free to be a child again, no longer forced to carry the burden of her grandfather's terrible secret. Agnes Murphy knelt beside them, offering the kind of understanding that only another survivor could provide. The crowd that had gathered to celebrate their town's founding now stood witness to the destruction of everything they'd thought they knew about their community's history. But in that destruction, Clay could see the seeds of something better, a community that might finally be ready to face hard truths and protect its most vulnerable members. As Ezra McKinnon was led away in chains, his broken cane left behind on the platform like a discarded symbol of false authority, Clay knew that the real work was just beginning. Justice had been served, but healing would take much longer. 6 months after the arrests that shattered Millbrook Creek's Founding Day celebration, Clay Hartwell sat on his front porch watching Sarah McKinnon play in the street with other children, her laughter carrying on the evening breeze like a promise of healing. The little girl who'd once trembled with fear and shame was learning to be a child again, supported by her parents, protected by a community that was slowly learning to face uncomfortable truths. Sarah's recovery hadn't been easy or quick. There had been nightmares, moments of withdrawal, and times when the weight of what she'd endured seemed too heavy for such small shoulders to carry. But Dr. Morrison had connected the McKinnon family with specialists in treating childhood trauma, and slowly, carefully, Sarah was beginning to trust that the adults in her life would protect rather than harm her. The silver locket that Ezra had, given her as a symbol of her victimization, had been replaced by something far more precious, a small leather-bound diary that Eleanor Whitfield had given her for Christmas, a place where Sarah could write down her thoughts and feelings as she worked to make sense of her experiences. Clay had watched Sarah write her first entry in that diary just last week, her small hand moving carefully across the page as she documented not the horrors of her past, but the simple joys of her present. A successful day at school, a kind word from a friend, the feeling of safety that came from sleeping through the night without fear. The transformation in Millbrook Creek had been profound and painful. The federal trials that followed the arrests had exposed the full scope of the criminal network that had operated throughout the territory for decades. Ezra McKinnon had been sentenced to life in prison, as had Judge Cornelius Stone and 7 other officials who'd participated in or protected the conspiracy. But the legal justice was only part of the healing process. The community itself had to confront the reality that their most respected leader had been their most dangerous predator, and that their willingness to avoid uncomfortable questions had enabled decades of child abuse. Mayor Harold Brennan had resigned in shame, admitting that his loyalty to Ezra had blinded him to evidence that should have prompted immediate action to protect children. The town council had been dissolved and reconstituted with new leadership that included Eleanor Whitfield, who'd been appointed to oversee new policies for child protection and safety. Agnes Murphy had returned to Millbrook Creek permanently, using her skills as a businesswoman to help rebuild the community's economic foundation, while also serving as an advocate for other survivors of abuse. She'd organized support groups for women who'd been victimized as children, creating a network of understanding and healing that hadn't existed before. "What I learned," Agnes had told Clay during one of their conversations about the community's recovery, "is that silence protects predators, not victims. Every family that left town quietly rather than speaking up made it easier for Ezra to hurt the next child. We can't change the past, but we can make sure it never happens again." The physical symbols of Ezra's influence had been systematically removed from Millbrook Creek. The foundation stone bearing his name had been replaced with a simple marker honoring all the children who deserved protection. The church bell dedication plaque had been melted down and reformed into a memorial for victims of abuse, inscribed with words that reflected the community's new understanding. "In memory of the innocent, in service of the vulnerable, in commitment to justice." Clay's own journey had been complicated by his role as both investigator and community member. The town council had formally reinstated him as sheriff and apologized for their hasty action in removing him from office, but Clay had declined to resume the position. 20 years was enough, he'd told Martha as they discussed their future. "I've done what I could as a lawman, but there are other ways to serve this community and protect its children." Instead, Clay had accepted a position as a territorial investigator, specializing in cases involving corruption and child abuse. His experience with the McKinnon case had made him uniquely qualified to recognize the signs of systematic abuse and the patterns of official cover-up that allowed predators to operate with impunity. Martha had supported his decision completely, understanding that her husband needed to channel his passion for justice into work that could help other communities avoid Millbrook Creek's painful experience. "You've found your calling," she'd told him after he'd completed his first successful investigation in a neighboring county. "Not just as a lawman, but as someone who speaks for children who can't speak for themselves." The new sheriff of Millbrook Creek was a woman named Catherine Barnes, a former federal marshal who'd impressed the town council with her combination of professional competence and unwavering commitment to protecting the vulnerable. Barnes had implemented new protocols for investigating complaints involving children, ensuring that accusations would be taken seriously regardless of the accused person's status in the community. Eleanor Whitfield had been appointed to a newly created position as child advocate, with authority to investigate any situation where a child's safety might be at risk. Her years of careful documentation and her willingness to speak uncomfortable truths had earned her the community's respect and trust. The schoolhouse had been expanded and updated, with new policies ensuring that children received education about recognizing inappropriate behavior from adults and reporting it to trusted authorities. Eleanor had developed age-appropriate curricula that taught children about personal safety while empowering them to trust their instincts and speak up when something felt wrong. "We can't protect children by keeping them ignorant," Eleanor had explained to parents who were initially uncomfortable with the new educational approach. "We protect them by giving them knowledge, language, and the confidence to seek help when they need it." The most profound change in Millbrook Creek was the community's new understanding of the relationship between silence and complicity. The painful truth that emerged from the trials was that Ezra's crimes had continued for decades, not because they were invisible, but because too many adults had chosen to look away rather than confront uncomfortable realities. Dr. Morrison had been particularly affected by this realization. His medical records had documented injuries and behavioral changes in multiple children over the years, but his respect for Ezra's reputation and his reluctance to make accusations without absolute proof had prevented him from reporting his suspicions. "To authorities, I took an oath to do no harm," Dr. Morrison had told Clay during one of their conversations about the community's healing process. "But I learned that sometimes failing to act is its own form of harm. Those children needed me to be brave enough to ask hard questions and report my concerns, even if I wasn't certain of my conclusions." The community had established new protocols for reporting suspected abuse, with multiple pathways for concerns to be raised and investigated. No single person or institution would have the power to suppress or ignore reports of child endangerment. As Clay sat on his porch that evening, watching Sarah play with the carefree joy that every child deserved, he reflected on the lessons that Millbrook Creek had learned through its painful journey toward justice. The town's founding story had been rewritten, not around the mythical figure of a benevolent patriarch, but around the real experiences of the families who'd built their lives there despite the presence of evil in their midst. The new story acknowledged both the community's failures and its capacity for growth and redemption. Most importantly, the new story centered the experiences and voices of those who'd been silenced for too long. Sarah's diary, with its honest accounts of healing and hope, had become a more important historical document than any of Ezra's self-serving records. Clay opened his own journal and began writing his final entry about the case that had changed. "Everything. Today, I watched Sarah McKinnon play with her friends, laughing and running without fear. 6 months ago, she was a child carrying secrets too terrible for anyone to bear alone. Tonight, she's just a little girl who knows she's loved, protected, and believed. That transformation didn't happen because we caught the man who hurt her, though justice was important. It happened because an entire community chose to listen to uncomfortable truths, face painful realities, and commit to doing better. Millbrook Creek isn't the same town it was a year ago. We've lost our illusions about the past, but we've gained something more valuable. The knowledge that protecting children requires constant vigilance, uncomfortable conversations, and the courage to act even when action is difficult. Sometimes, doing what's right means destroying what's comfortable. But in our case, what we destroyed was built on lies and maintained through the silence of good people who were afraid to speak difficult truths. What we're building now is founded on honesty, accountability, and the understanding that the most vulnerable among us deserve our protection, not our willful blindness. Sarah McKinnon will grow up in a community that failed her once, but learned from that failure. She'll live in a place where children's voices are heard, where their safety is prioritized, and where the adults responsible for protecting them understand that comfortable lies are more dangerous than uncomfortable truths. That's not a perfect outcome, but it's a just one. And sometimes, in a world where perfect justice is impossible, a just outcome is enough to build hope upon. As Clay closed his journal and prepared to go inside for the evening, he could hear Sarah's mother calling her in for dinner. The little girl said goodbye to her friends and skipped toward home, her diary clutched in her small hands, ready to write about another day of healing, another step toward the future that every child deserves. The sun was setting over Millbrook Creek, painting the sky in shades of gold and red that promised a new day ahead. It would be a day in a town that had learned to face its shadows, to speak difficult truths, and to choose the protection of innocence over the preservation of comfortable lies. And that, Clay thought as he watched Sarah disappear safely into her home, was a legacy worth building a future upon.